you have to sort of have both conflicting thoughts in your head at any given time. And I think that's very key to the entrepreneurial experience. You have to believe you can do it, but you have to soberly confront all of the ways in which it might not work.
Welcome to the Founders Anonymous podcast. I'm Raj Suri, co-founder of Lima and Tribe. Today we have Waseem Daher, co-founder and executive chairman of Pilot. And Imad cannot make it today. He just had his third kid. He will be here next week, hopefully. I'm not sure how long his time off will be, but congratulations, Imad. Please, if you hear this, send him a tweet, send him a congratulatory note. And welcome, Waseem, to the Founders Anonymous podcast. You and I have known each other for a while, and it's great to catch up.
Yeah, thanks for having me. Really great to be here.
Yeah, it's great to have you here. And you've done some really interesting companies. And why don't you tell the audience a little bit about Pilot, but also some of your other companies?
Sure. So Pilot does accounting and tax prep for startups and SMBs. And it was really born out of pain we had in our previous companies. And I think you probably experienced this firsthand, but anyone who has a company of any kind, whether it's a tech company or a coffee shop or a doctor's office, there's some reason that you start your business. There's a product or service you want to bring into the world. And what you soon realize is, yes, of course you focus on that, but there's all of this back office stuff. And the back office stuff is important and scary and tedious, and you really just need a good partner to do it for you. And that's really where we come in. We run your back office so you can focus on your business. Really initially starting with what we call the financial back office. So accounting, tax prep, fractional CFO, that kind of stuff.
And I mean, this is a very different industry than your previous companies, right? Like you've done some really different things in your career. First one I remember is KSplice. Explain what that was about.
Yes. So the three companies were very different. The first company, KSplice, was my co-founder Jeff's master's thesis at MIT. He had developed some technology that let you apply updates to a running system without rebooting. I'm sure you've seen that pop up. That's like, you must reboot to install new updates. We had some tech that could take those updates and transform them so they could be applied on the system while it was still running, which is convenient for you or me, but is actually really, really valuable for server farms and data centers and that kind of thing. And we bootstrapped that company. We did it in Cambridge. We operated it for about 3 years, grew it to 7 figures in revenue, and Oracle acquired it. And basically a year and a day after the acquisition, kind of got the band back together, said, okay, we want to do something new. The second company was a tool called Zulip. It was a group chat tool. It was a kind of Slack-like app at a time when Slack, I think, was still making a mobile game. We had a sort of opinionated take on what group chat should be like at work. Operated that company for a little bit under 2 years. Dropbox acquired it. And then obviously Pilot is, we're doing accounting, and we're doing it in a tech-enabled way. Like we employ a bunch of talented accountants, and then we write a bunch of software under the hood that we use to do the work more accurately, more reliably, more consistently. But there's not much of a through line between Linux kernel updates, business group chat, and accounting and tax prep for startups, other than these were all problems we ourselves had, when doing the previous companies or kind of at various points in our lives.
Yeah, I mean, it's remarkable kind of how similar our journeys are in some ways, because I've also done multiple companies now and done it for the same reasons. So but we've done such different companies. So we're remarkably different companies, and but it's for the same reasons. So it kind of just shows how varied the founder journey can be.
And I think ultimately it's like you got to be excited about the team you're doing it with, and you have to be passionate about the space. But I don't think you have to be like a travel founder or like a B2C founder. I think you are more versatile than maybe you think. And so I think I encourage second and third time founder to lean into that. Don't feel constrained by, this is what I know, and therefore this is what I have to do.
What have you enjoyed the most? I mean, like, which parts of the journey have you enjoyed the most? And where do you feel like your like arc has kind of evolved to? Like maybe something in the beginning that you kind of like struggled with, but now you've figured out, or maybe something you're struggling with now that earlier was easier. I'm sure we could exchange a lot of war stories here.
Yeah, it's been interesting. I mean, we've been doing pilots since early 2017. So, we're in year 8. And I think it has been fascinating to kind of see the evolution of the company and the role in that time. And I think one of the things that's great and really fun about the founder role is you are constantly kind of pushed to the level of your own incompetence. Like once you finally master it, if the company is growing, well, you're now playing a new game that you actually don't know how to play before, that you haven't played before. And so there's definitely some intellectual satisfaction associated with just having to constantly level up because you have no option but to do that. Like the company needs you to step up and figure out the next thing. It's like, okay, you got to 10 million ARR, great. How do you get to 20? How do you get to 50? Okay, what does that imply about how you build the org and how you run the org, et cetera, et cetera? I think the thing I didn't appreciate is actually, I think it's really important for founders to understand what they're good at, but more importantly, kind of like what gives them energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I think I have found a lot of joy in really the 0 to 1 kind of early days, like getting the thing up and running much more than I have okay, you're CEO of the multi-100-person company and your job is to kind of build the machine, like to make the organization do the right things. And that's an important and worthy goal, and it's a hard job, and there are people that are phenomenal at it. It happened to not be one that actually was particularly a source of energy for me personally. And so actually in 2024, my co-founder Jessica became CEO, and I transitioned to the executive chair role, which has been awesome. I'm really getting to spend time really kind of in the trenches again on sort of scrappy things that I think really move the needle for the business, where I sort of uniquely have good context for it. But I don't think I would have expected that. I mean, I think many founders, they start the company and they think like, oh, I'm going to be like Mark Zuckerberg or Jeff Bezos or whatever, like I'm CEO till the end. And I don't, if that's what, floats your boat, do it. I think it was interesting for me to realize like, okay, I'm not sure I'm the best person at this job. And even if I am, which I don't think I am, I think Jessica's doing it better. I'm not sure I even want it.
Yeah, absolutely. Again, remarkable how similar, your journey is to mine. I mean, I also felt the same. That I really enjoyed the 0 to 1 aspect. And I actually think that Mark Zuckerberg and Jeff Bezos are not that different in some ways too. If you look at Mark Zuckerberg, like what seems to give him energy is like doing new things within Meta, right?
Totally.
And same with Jeff. I mean, he left Amazon. He's doing a new thing now. I saw a podcast with him where he's like working like harder than he ever worked at Amazon, on Blue Origins. And so what seems to give these folks energy is actually very similar. I have a theory that people like that stay in the CEO role for a long time, mainly to give the company some stability because they don't have a good successor.
Totally.
And, I felt the same at Presto. So I left Presto after we were public. And, at some point I also felt like I really wanted to do 0 to 1 again and kind of like experience that again. And it's really what I love to do. But at the same time, I felt like if I would leave, it would create problems. And I think it's true that actually when in some cases, if you don't get the right successor, it creates a lot of problems in the company. And
totally. I mean, it
can
freaks
kill a
people out
company.
no matter what. Now, in our case, like I think the reason it was so smooth is like Jessica was, I think, even more well liked and even higher credibility than I was at Pilot. And so in some ways, it made sense. Like for her to step into the role. I think if we were like, hey, here's some random new person you've never met before who like looks like a corporate type who doesn't really know what we're about, that's going to freak people out. Yes. That'll freak your
Was she a
employees out.
co-founder?
That'll freak
What
your
was her?
customers
How
out.
did she?
Yeah, she was the co-founder. Yeah.
Okay, great. So yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I think that type of person can work. You've seen it go well in a few cases. Like Satya is doing a great job at Microsoft.
Sure.
But it was interesting that someone like Ballmer couldn't do a great job, right? Like even though he was there early. So yes, the CEO role is so important. And I felt like a big part of the CEO job that no one talks about really is like just preventing bad things from happening in the company. Like and nobody talks about those. Everyone talks about what the CEO is doing, but very few people talk about what the CEO is preventing from happening. And when you have a new CEO, in some cases, I would say the majority of cases, the company can often go in like a wrong direction and just do things that don't make sense. And the company often doesn't know how to take on risk because like they take a risk on in the wrong way. Like, you and I would be very comfortable taking on 0 to 1 risk, but like someone who's not comfortable with that would often let it either overwhelm the company or not do it well enough to like make an impact.
I think there's an advantage to having the moral authority to turn the ship. Because sometimes like you have to say, hey, what we're doing is not working, or it's not working as well as it could be working. And to really take it to the next level, we need to make a big change in how we do things. And I think that's hard for people you bring in to do because they kind of don't want to rock the boat too much. Like it is easier in many ways to preserve the status quo, which probably is going like pretty well. It's dangerous to say, hey, I'm going to gamble pretty well in favor of like great outcome. It takes a certain amount of conviction and credibility to pull that off. And I agree that it is rare that the kind of external CEO sort of has that.
Yeah. Yeah, and there's so many horror stories, right? It's interesting, Apple's Tim Cook was in the news, I think, on Twitter this week, where he like released an iPad Air. Did you see this? Everyone was criticizing him for the iPad Air, because it's like it looks really like not innovative. They're basically calling Apple like rent seeking at this point,
Sure.
and they're um, you kind of Tim Cook was a good CEO for a while, but like Apple's kind of running out of rope. It feels like on their next generation stuff. So it's interesting
Yeah,
to see how
it's
all these
interesting
different
because you
companies do
like
it.
want the sustaining people and you want the like new people. Like I think probably people say similarly about Andy Jassy, like super steady hands on the reins at Amazon, like one foot in front of the other. It's going super well. You know, is that where the like next breakthrough product line is going to come from? Yeah, unclear. I think Tim Cook has done an amazing job generating shareholder value. I agree with you that we haven't seen anything sort of eye-poppingly novel from Apple in a while. I mean, Vision Pro maybe, but I think the market maybe was a little too early on that one.
I mean, Vision Pro is a perfect example of what I was just talking about, which is like not knowing how to take on risk, right? Like not knowing how to like take on a new product, and like in Vision Pro case, they went way too far, right? In like taking on too many features, too much. The problem is they're trying to apply a template. Maybe like, oh yeah, the iPhone was like this, and we did this with the iPhone, and now let's do this with the Vision Pro. But it's not the same product. It's a very different type of product. And I mean, it's a perfect example of not knowing how to, take on risk, and take on like, really innovating on the product side.
Sure.
So, I mean, we'll see. I'm not very bullish on Apple at this point. I would say like they need to make some big changes long term. But the iPhone monopoly is, they're really so profitable. The best business of ever, the best product ever created, or the most profitable product ever created. It's they can maybe go on for another decade, just like
Sure.
creating off that, right? I have a bunch of questions for you on like, your LinkedIn post, because you have a lot of very interesting LinkedIn posts.
Sure.
When did you decide doing that? This was kind of somewhat recent, right? You started posting some really like,
It's interesting. There was a time, I think like a couple years ago, where I had a pretty good cadence and I had a Substack that I basically published weekly and I was really like on top of it. And then I kind of just, I fell off a cliff a little bit. I sort of neglected it. And then a couple months ago, I was like, okay, I need to get serious about this again.
yeah.
And I think this was also coupled with the transition out of the CEO role, which is like, okay, actually, I do have a little bit more time for things I think are important, but are maybe previously like felt a little bit discretionary.
One thing that, one of the biggest things I learned is something you posted, which I haven't seen anyone else post, is about like not wanting to be well liked. It's such a difficult thing for a human being to not want to be well liked, especially as a leader of like a group. Talk more about that. Like, what did you learn about like optimizing for popularity as like a leader versus other things?
Yeah, it's interesting because in the early days of the company, you're building it with your friends. And so probably you are like well liked and high trust by default because like
Hmm.
you knew these people, you were all in school together, or you'd worked together in a previous company, or you have some tie that kind of binds you. And so you get a lot of sort of like trust and credibility for free.
Hmm.
And then as the company grows, that as the default state tends to erode a little bit. It's not the case that employee 250 or employee 300 necessarily likes or trusts or thinks that you're doing a good job.
Hmm.
And furthermore, I think what's interesting is like there are some cases where it is so clear what the right thing is for the company, but it's not going to be popular. And you know that. And I think there's a temptation among the inexperienced founder to say, well, I don't want to do it because like people are going to be mad at me or, I don't know, they'll complain or whatever. And that is just a recipe for the company dying. Like,
Hmm.
unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, I don't know. I think startups are successful when they push forward on an opinionated viewpoint and just go firmly in one direction. And if you are instead sort of governed by consensus, you're going to get consensus results. You're going to get sort of mediocre results. And a desire to be well liked is ultimately a desire to stick to the consensus, right? It's like if you're doing the most popular thing, you're basically saying, okay, well, let's have everyone vote and let's do that. And that will prevent you structurally from making any hard decisions. And so I think like if that's what you're optimizing for, you're not governing the company well. It's like it's actually not responsible. It's not responsible for the company. It's not responsible for the shareholders. Like you owe your employees like having some backbone and being willing to make hard and unpopular decisions. And I think if you can't do that, like it seems pretty unlikely that it's going to work because inevitably there will be hard times. When things are going great, you don't need to make any hard decisions. But when maybe like growth is slowing or whatever, it's like actually you have to make the call. And the call is necessarily going to be unpopular because some percentage of folks will not agree with you. And that compounds as the company's size grows. If there are 300 people and 1% of them, which is a super low percent, if 1% disagree with you, that's still 3 people, right? I mean, definitionally, at any time, someone is unhappy about something you're doing. And so you just have to kind of embrace that. You have to accept that that's fine. That is part of the job. And like, you cannot get too worked up over it.
Yeah. And I think that's a great point. And it's not obvious for a lot of new founders and new CEOs. I think one thing that I learned, though, is a nuance is like the way you implement these unpopular decisions actually matters a lot. So like there is a real skill in execution of like unpopular decisions. There's a way to get over people's concerns in a way that doesn't make them like overly vocal, like or overly like disappointed or
Sure.
disheartened. I think what founders often think about is like, oh, this person is so important and they're not happy with this decision.
Right.
What if they leave, right? What if they just like, oh, they leave, they join a competitor, or they leave and they take some people with them, like and I think so the people who actually have the pushback actually matter, right? It's not, if they're high performing people, it's
Sure.
actually much harder to make an unpopular decision, but it's still the right case, right? And so what I found really helps is explaining the decision in great detail, like explaining the rationale in like great detail. And what doesn't go well is that if you say this is the decision, I'm the CEO, let's get with it. You get with the program, disagree and commit, blah blah blah. Like that doesn't go well. What goes really well is like having a deck to like explain your decision, or having a memo to explain your decision,
Sure.
and going over it. And even when people disagree, you can say, "Yep, here's exactly my rationale. Here's where you believe that's different from what I believe." And but this is what I believe, and this is what we're going to do, and just being very granular about it. Um, and I found that to go really well, and I found that there are instances where I didn't do that, and then people did actually quit, and like it got worse. It made the situation much worse. So yeah, that would be my nuance on that.
I think that, so I have another post about this where it's like you have to not neglect the comms. Like
Mhm.
you have the full state of the company probably in your head. You know what's going on at all these various people and all these various places. Other people don't. And so you do have to bring them along for the ride. Now,
Mhm.
that's distinct from saying I'm opening this up for debate. Like you are telling, you are not asking. You're saying, hey, listen, we're doing XYZ. I know some of you may not be excited about it. Here is why. Like it's signaling this was carefully considered. This is why we're doing it. This is why we think it's the best option. And yes, I understand that it kind of sucks. And like I also feel bad that it sucks, but it's like the right thing for the company.
Mhm.
I agree that like you got to bring people along for the ride. If it feels like you just arbitrarily one day decided to wake up and do a thing that makes no sense to them, like that's extremely demoralizing because it's just like it's super opaque. It's like it undermines their trust in what you're doing. Whereas if you say, hey, this is what we're doing, I know it's not going to be popular, this is why I think it's necessary, you're giving folks an insight into how you're thinking about it. You're letting them know that it was not a casual thing. It was well considered. It was the option of last resort, whatever it is.
Yeah. And I think the even higher difficulty move is to actually open it up for debate. Like that's like and which is in some cases a something that it's the right thing to do in some cases, because you have a lot of smart people at your company and you actually do want to get their opinion, before you make a decision, right? And if it's a big decision, like you sometimes like different people's opinion, different people's data actually may matter. But the problem is when you do that, is like before decision, you don't make a decision, then open it for debate, right? That's like, but like before you make a decision, you might want to have like a debate and solicit everyone's opinion. The problem is sometimes it gets very political, and like you develop camps, and like the camps are trying to influence you in different ways, right? And like it can get very nasty inside if it's a big decision. Like, there's and one of my goals have always been to like minimize politics in whatever I do, and like and minimize the incentives for politics. But in like debates like that, you can actually get it. But sometimes it's the right thing because you want to get all those competing opinions like before you actually make that big decision. It's hard to do. I would say it's hard to pull off in a way that everyone feels good about it afterwards.
Yes. I mean, I think there's your point is exactly right, which is the time for that is before the decision is made. After the decision is made, like, it cannot be
Mhm.
the case that anyone can go and
Mhm.
veto or relitigate a thing that your company is doing. It just doesn't work that way. And I think you're right. There's a thoughtful balance of you want to read your key people in because they may know things you don't. At the same time, you want to avoid the kind of like in-group, out-group dynamic. And obviously, the more like, depending on the decision and how confidential the decision needs to be, the like wider the circle of consultation, uh, the greater the probability that folks hear about it via the rumor mill, which is even worse than like clearer comms from you.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think the other point you're making with this your LinkedIn post about being well liked is that focus on winning. And like I think that's a really important point. Like if you look at like CEO popularity on a Glassdoor and stuff like that, it's often very correlated to like how well the company's doing. If the
Yes.
company's not doing well, like you might be the funniest, most likable person in the world.
Yes.
People are not going to be happy. But if your company's doing well, even if you're a jerk, like you can see this with Elon today to some degree, right? Like, you know, um, people like you and stick with the company, and it's kind of I actually think the best ground is like, okay, your company is winning, but you also care about your people. I think that's the best scenario. But if you had to pick one, you just pick winning, right?
Well, it solves a lot of other problems. Maybe we could say it masks a lot of other problems, but also it solves a lot of other problems.
What do you think of like Elon style? I'm curious. You and I have never talked about this. You seem like a very empathetic type of guy. Like, I feel like I fear a lot of founders are gonna like copy someone like Elon and like go in with a chainsaw, and make decisions like seemingly capriciously in many cases.
It's tough because I think it's hard to argue with the results. I mean, if you look at Tesla or SpaceX or, whatever, it's like these are iconic generational companies, and it's hard to say that those were easy to do. Is it I don't think it's the only way. I mean, obviously, like Steve Jobs was in this mold as well, Bill Gates to some extent in the early days. I don't think it's the only path. I
Mm.
think i there's a certain amount of I don't think it succeeds because you are a jerk. In some ways, it succeeds in spite of your being a jerk. You have to have the talent to kind of back it up. I think the challenge is like you're not Steve Jobs or not Elon Musk, and you try to copy that playbook, and like no, now you're just a jerk. Like that's not going to work for you. I
Mhm.
think what is true is that like all of these folks are, have essentially started what are effectively cults. Like, and I say that actually as like kind of a good thing, which is like the team are deep believers in the mission and the task at hand, and they are gonna go, you know, above and beyond to make it happen. And I think that kind of fanatical devotion, again, it's not a sufficient condition for success, but it doesn't hurt. Like, I think if channeled the right way, that can be very effective. Like, I don't think, I guess, like, let's look at the converse or whatever. I think if you have a team that does not care deeply, it is unlikely that you're going to get great results. Now, is the way that you get the team to care deeply, does that require like having them sleep in the office and like yelling at them or whatever? Like, no, I don't think it necessarily does. Um, but if you can't get that like deep level of care and ownership and passion, like it's not going to work. Like, look, Tim Cook is kind of the opposite of these guys, but there's like a
Mhm.
great anecdote in one of these, some book where like Tim Cook is in a meeting with his executive team and they're talking about some problem with iPhone production or whatever. And he's like, yeah, someone is going to have to go to China and like check on what's happening here,
Mhm.
like to some executive. And then like 30 minutes later, like they're still in the meeting and Tim Cook turns to this guy. He's like, why are you still here? Like,
Yeah.
yeah, I meant like right now. And like the guy like goes and gets in his car, like drives to SFO and like buys the ticket and like goes to China. It's like, I do think that if you want to make great things, you have to care deeply.
Mhm.
And now, caring deeply does not necessarily require an 80-hour week. I think in some cases it doesn't hurt, but it's like that. It's a subtle distinction, and that's probably how I would walk the line on it.
Yeah, I think you need to know how to drive your team in a way that gets maximum output but doesn't burn them out, right? You don't want to burn out your team, and you can. I mean, like we've all seen it at some point. Like you can burn people out. People have lives outside work. You have to be, yeah. So I do think you have to be a human being as a CEO or a leader. Like, you know, mm, you have to. I think you'll get better results if the team knows you also care about them.
Yes,
Um, but I agree that it may not be necessary, for success. Like, it might be you're just maniacal about the output. I do think at some point, like, if you've gone through hell and you've come out the other side with a success, the team bond and like the cult nature of the team gets very strong. And I've
unbreakable.
seen this
Yes,
happen. Yeah.
yes. I mean, look at the key people at these Elon Musk companies, like, or in Amazon. It's like I think there's like, I think it's fine for your company to be a filter, where it's like some people are all about it and some people don't click. I think that's okay. It doesn't have to appeal to everyone.
Mhm.
Clearly, something is working at some of these places because the loyalists are super loyal.
Mhm.
And like, it, it's kind of like the 10x engineer in a way. It's like actually a small number of people who are super passionate and super committed will drive more outcome for you than a large collection of folks who are just like kind of phoning it in. And so
Totally.
maybe the TLDR on this is like figure out how to get a small, really passionate team that is like dedicated to making the thing great. And I think there
Mhm.
are a number of paths to doing that.
Yeah. Yeah, I've seen this actually happen, at Presto, my last company, where we went through a few near-death moments, together, and a lot of people left, but the group that stayed, through that are still very tight even today, right? So like, those types of, going through these crucible moments with a group of folks who like really care is like a life-changing thing for a lot of
Definitely.
people, in those moments. Tesla has gone through a lot of pain. Amazon's been through a lot of pain, and SpaceX. These are all companies that have been through multiple near-death moments. And Elon has been at the front end of like Tesla and SpaceX, like taking the arrows straight on, right? So, like I think that gives him a lot of credibility with his team.
I do think there's a certain amount of lead from the front that is very key. It's like I wouldn't ask you to do anything I wouldn't personally do.
Mhm.
And look, all I think you can. I don't think this is a hot take. I think you can respect Elon as an entrepreneur while not necessarily agreeing with his political views.
Mhm.
I wish I like held both in the same esteem. I happen not to. Um, but I think those are separable things in a way. And I think some of the discourse here gets lost, which is like, I think people say, people struggle to say, well, I think, Tesla is a generational company, while also saying, I don't agree with what Elon is currently doing on XYZ. And I actually think it is possible to say both of those things. But, the discourse does not really permit that.
Well, yeah. I mean, now we're seeing things like people, like Tesla has become like a political target now in some ways. I saw an article in the New York Times just a couple of days ago. You know, people driving Teslas are being like heckled, or like, I think someone put fire to like a Tesla supercharger station.
Sure.
Yeah, so it's getting pretty nasty, but it's a great car. Yeah, but I would say some of the political takes are very hard to to read as well. So I understand some of the concern on that end as well.
Certainly.
Um, one thing you mentioned, I think this is a good jumping off point to this other thing that you've brought up, which I think is again something that very few people talk about is like, startups die when they lose the will to live and not when they run out of money. And the reason why this is like somewhat a contrarian point is like I think most people, even VCs and other people, they're all, everyone's really focused on the money side, which everyone should be very conservative. But like once as a founder, you've been through like a near death situation, you kind of know that really the will to live is the only thing that matters. And it actually gives you a lot of confidence in all sorts of situations. So maybe talk more about this. And where did you, think through, how did you kind of come up with this concept?
Yeah, I mean, look, the money is again, it's all this is the theme of our conversation here is kind of about necessary versus sufficient conditions. Like the money is necessary. Your business cannot exist in the absence of money. You like can't employ people. You can't, do things. But it is also not enough. Like you have to have people who are first of all, the founders have to be passionate. They have to believe that it will work. And if those things are not present, it doesn't matter how well funded you are, the company's not going to succeed. Like if the founding team and if the team in general, like doesn't believe it can win, your best people won't stay. The people that are there aren't going to do good work. It's just like you end up either on a path to mediocrity or you just give up and like shut the thing down.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I mean, one thing I would say, having been through cases where we're almost run out of money several times. I would say my last company, close to 10 times, like an obscene amount of times. Like most companies go through like one or
Sure.
two
Yeah.
near death moment. I've been through like a lot more. Um, but the will to live was always very strong, and I think I was explaining this to other folks recently. Is like when you're evaluating founders, that's really the main thing that distinguishes a founder from other people. Like you can have smarter people in your company, you can have more talented engineers, more better designers and stuff. But the founders are typically the people with the most motivation, and not just because of like equity stake, but also because they really care about the problem they're solving, and they're willing to just drive through walls, right? To get there. Um,
I mean, I think dispositionally, just some people are like more tenacious and resilient than others. And like, that's not necessarily bad or good or whatever, but I think it is a key element in startup success. And actually, the reason I got to this is a little funny is like from these kind of like prepper survival books, basically,
mhm.
where they say like in the preface of one of these books, they're like, listen, yes, of course you need to know how to make a fire and set traps and all this. And like the knowledge matters and like your kit, like your supplies matter. But actually you just sort of have to believe that you are gonna make it work. There's a thing called the Stockdale paradox, and I'm gonna mess it up, but it's just like this was some interview with Stockdale, who was, it was like a Vietnam War POW. And he's like, you simultaneously need to soberly like confront and understand how perilous and dire your situation is. But you also have to believe that like you are going to get through it. And you have to have both of those elements, like just naively believing that it will change tomorrow, you'll get disheartened and give up. Dwelling on like we're so screwed, like you will also get disheartened and give up. It's just like you have to sort of have both conflicting thoughts in your head at any given time. And I think that's very key to the entrepreneurial experience. You have to believe you can do it, but you have to soberly confront all of the ways in which it might not work.
That's brilliant. Yeah, it's interesting that the POW actually, had the same mindset than that a startup founder. It's like, yeah, but that's exactly right. You have to be rational about where you are, but also believe that you can figure it out, and that takes almost some level of insanity. But it's
Oh, definitely.
yeah,
Definitely.
but
There's a certain amount of like self-delusion required because you are doing something that by all odds is not going to be successful. Like the odds are not in your favor. It almost certainly will not work. Like you will almost certainly not make it to that next milestone. Like if you look at the filter, it's like from companies that are started all the way to companies that IPO or whatever, like the percentage that advanced each level is like not large. And
Mhm.
so to kind of like face those odds and say, but I think we're the ones that are going to do it. Like you have to be a little crazy.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And your tolerance for pain has to be pretty high, and like it's almost like you're running a marathon. They always say it's a marathon, not a sprint, but you're running at a pretty fast pace, and it's like it's pretty tiring and painful along the way. So it does take it takes a lot of grit, and it's but it one thing I found about my own personal journey is that I've come to enjoy it. I've come to enjoy the all these parts. That maybe early on, like you're on the steep part of the learning curve, it feels quite painful, like going through all the challenges and not knowing what to do. But like as kind of know what you're doing, even though you're learning new things, you're starting to enjoy that pain a little bit more. I don't know what about you. Yeah.
I think the second time founder experience, the third time founder experience, like you just know that it can be done.
Mhm.
And people talk a lot about the 4 minute mile, but I like the 4 minute mile story, which is like, Raj Bannister, whoever ran the 4 minute mile,
Mhm.
people thought it was impossible. when it was demonstrated that it was possible, lots of other people could do it, and
Yeah.
did do it shortly thereafter because suddenly they believed it could be done. And I think as a second time founder, you're like, well, I actually have done this before. So I know that it is possible, so I will do it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's amazing how much that mindset changes outcomes. So you talk about talking smack about your competitors or not talking smack about your competitors. And I think this is a really interesting matrix that you've come up with, David and Goliath.
Sure.
And you also talk about leaning into being a small company. I love this. Maybe explain how you think about A, leaning into being a small company, and B, talking about competitors.
Sure. So on the David Goliath thing, this is actually an idea from Guy Kawasaki in one of his books where he says basically people like to root for the underdogs, position yourself as an underdog. And if you're not the underdog, talking about your competitors actually hurts you because you're giving them free airtime, you're giving them free publicity. This is supposedly, and this is kind of a dumb thing, it's supposedly politicians will never say the name of their opponents. They'll just say my opponent or the other guy. It's because they don't want to give them free airtime.
Mhm.
And I think there's some truth to that, which is if you're out there saying, oh, you know, don't use XYZ, use Pilot. What you're basically saying is, hey, if you haven't cross-shopped against XYZ, maybe you should. Pilot is worried enough about them that they mention them by name.
Mhm.
And so if they're your size or smaller, that's not to your advantage. Now, if you're some tiny database company and you talk smack about Oracle, yeah, that's a fun story. People like that. It's it's not like those people were unaware that Oracle existed. You're not turning them on to a possible competitor that they weren't previously aware of. So that's, I think, about the kind of David and Goliath. You want to be David, you want to find your Goliath, and you want to kind of pick a fight with them because either they do nothing, in which case it's a nice narrative, or they actually respond, in which case you're getting a bunch of free airtime. If they actually punch back, wow, that's great. Oracle mentioned us. That's amazing. That's amazing free publicity. And then on leaning into being a startup is listen, as a startup, you have very few structural advantages. Your only advantages are you can move fast and that you're small. And so I recommend folks don't try to hide that. Take advantage of it. So when you're talking to a prospect, it's a big account. It would be your biggest account. They're competing. You're competing against the industry standard person who probably they would by default use. I think it's very powerful to say, well, listen, yeah, they're the big guys, but this is a huge deal for us. And I'm the founder, I'm the CEO, and this is my personal cell phone number, and I am going to make sure that we knock it out of the park for you. And the other guys just can't do that. And yeah, they're just too big to care about you, but I'm going to make sure you have an amazing experience. I'm going to make it super concierge for you. We're going to make sure it works super well. And I'm backing it up with my personal guarantee. Call me if if you ever have any trouble. That's pretty compelling because what does the customer want? The customer wants their problem to be solved. And so they have to believe that you are more likely to solve their problem comprehensively or in a good way than the alternative. And if the alternative is a nameless, faceless organization where you can't get anyone on the phone, it is very powerful to say, well, listen, this is a huge deal for us. Our team is going to go above and beyond to make sure it works well for you.
I think that's such a important point for founders to realize is that their size is actually an advantage. I want founders to be thinking about them being smaller as an advantage, not just not a disadvantage.
Yes. And it is, if deployed correctly,
Yes.
it is an advantage. Because if you try to act like a big company, you're just a big company with less funding and less of a brand. If you run their playbook, you definitionally run it worse. So you have to run a playbook that they cannot run.
Yeah, exactly. I my last company competed with Google and Apple and Microsoft and much bigger competitors. And I came up with so many good lines for why we're better. I remember one meeting, someone told me oh, this competitor said they're making more of this product. They have a lot more deployed. And I'm yeah, McDonald's also makes a lot of burgers. Are they the best burger? And that one line actually totally reversed the deal. We won the deal. So,
Totally.
because it was, we were also selling to a restaurant. So, but it was, it resonated. But I remember that this kind of debate that people have over bigger versus smaller, right?
Yes.
Um, and I feel right now, one of the reasons why I'm in the 0 to 1 phase again is because I feel 0 to 1 is a big advantage actually. And when I'm trying to, if you want to build something, that's disruptive and something that really changes the way, people live, then you want to actually have a smaller company because you can be way more nimble, way more agile. You can take risks that bigger companies can't. And you and I have now seen like what kind of bigger companies look like, right? Like they're very slow and they're very bureaucratic and
Yes.
they're very political. They have a lot of lawyers. They have a lot of people telling them what not to do. Um, and it's tough. Actually, I respect the people, people like Drew who try to, run Dropbox and be innovative, right? That it's hard. It's a hard job. It's much harder, in fact, than to do that job than
Yes.
to run a small company and like
I agree.
innovate. Yeah.
There are real diseconomies of scale. Like there are economies of scale, there are advantages to being large, but there are very real material diseconomies of scale. And there have to be, like, first principles thinking here. If there weren't, there would never be startups. Like it would not be
Mm.
possible for a startup to exist if startups had no advantages over big companies. Big companies would just totally dominate the landscape.
Yeah. Yeah. And one thing I also wish founders would know is like how much revenue starts to like control a company at a certain stage. Once you have a stream of revenue, it like kind of dominates you. Like the whole like soul of the company goes into like protecting that revenue and
Right.
growing that piece of
Sustaining
revenue.
it,
Yeah.
incrementally growing it.
Yeah. Yeah. And just natural. It's like I've seen apps. It's just so natural for people to like, build all their systems around that. And so it gets very hard to like develop new forms of revenue, and it gets very hard to also kill that source of revenue. Because you're like, hey, this is not going to be a long term thing, or it's not a big enough market. So these are, once you've been through it before, you could see like there's a real disadvantage. Not to say they have no advantage. People are, buyers are still risk averse. They still like brand names. They still like well funded companies. So, there is a lot. There are real advantages there, but a skilled founder can definitely overcome those.
Yes, I strongly agree.
One question, just whatever, you're almost 20 years in, 18 years into the journey, right? What are your ambitions still? Like, obviously you're part of Pilot still. You're still leading from the front there. But like, what's left unfulfilled for you? I'm curious, just as a fellow founder.
It's interesting because on the one hand, I think it's important to realize that you never, in fact, beat the game. There is like always another goalpost. So I think it's a little bit dangerous to be like, oh, well, if only we got to IPO, I would finally like consider myself done.
Yeah.
Because then there's like, oh, well, if only we were a $10 billion company, or oh, if only we were, whatever, an iconic blah, blah, blah. It's like, so it's a little bit dangerous to think that way. I think you have to sort of like enjoy it in the moment. But also, like, I do think we are working on something like large and iconic and enduring, where like we have only achieved a very small fraction of what we aspire to achieve, and I'm excited to see that through. And so I think you have to find joy in the day-to-day of it. I think the delayed gratification of like, I'm just going to grind and finally when we IPO I'll be happy or whatever, I think is like not really a great way to live your life. And so I try to ask myself, time averaged over the past X time period, like, does this feel like a good use of my time? Like, am I having fun? Am I learning? Is it impactful for the company? Are we doing a great job for our customers? Like, if so, it's a great way to spend your time. If it's not, you should probably do something else.
Totally. Yeah. And it's interesting to me how few founders actually last for this long. Like many founders that I know of, probably like they don't want to do it anymore. They either like can retire because they made money. So like many founders have just opted to like live a life of, investing and, advising and things like that. Right. It's actually very common.
Yeah.
I would say half founders do that once they've had an exit. Right. And then some founders like, choose to, but maybe they'll join a VC firm, right? That's another one that they do, which I consider is also like retirement, to some degree.
Yes.
And so very few are actually in the journey, like, I would say 25% or less,
Sure.
over a decade in, right? Um, or they're just kind of done a small company and they just keep doing the small company for a long time. So
Yeah.
I think it's been interesting for me to see like what that cohort looks like, right, over
Sure.
time. And you know, what inspires you to this day? Like when you look at other folks and like, like, oh wow, I want to, it still keeps you going. So, you seem like you read a lot, you study a lot. What inspires you these days?
I mean, you have to like enjoy the craft and you have to enjoy working with the team. Like you have to find the day-to-day fulfilling. If you don't, again, it's not gonna, you'll just burn out. I think there's like, 5% arrogance in it too. It's like, well, other people have like, achieved outcomes to this scale. Like we think we're as smart as they are. Like surely we can. So there's a little I think a little chip on your shoulder does help. It is not sufficient. I think you need more than that. I think you actually have to like figure out how to make it work for you. But there is just like a real joy in we set out to do this thing and we're doing it and people like it and we think it's helping them. And like there's like a real dopamine hit from like having that experience and like that it's fun.
I totally agree, man. And on that happy note, we can conclude the podcast. Thank you so much for coming. It's great to catch up after,
Yes, for
I don't even
sure.
know last time I saw you when.
A long time ago. Thanks for having me.